On a crisp autumn morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Atlanta, Officer Richard Thompson sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. His mind wandered to the complaint filed against him last week, another accusation of using excessive force during a routine traffic stop. The department had cleared him, as usual, but the whispers around the precinct were getting louder. A silver Honda Civic rolled through the stop sign at the corner of Maple and Oak Streets. Thompson's lips curled into a slight smile as he flipped on his lights. The car pulled over promptly, and he could see a woman behind the wheel, her husband in the passenger seat. Michelle Richardson was having a wonderful morning until she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. At 7 months pregnant, she had just left her final ultrasound appointment, clutching the latest pictures of their baby girl in her purse. Her husband David, a respected high school chemistry teacher, had taken the morning off to be there for this special moment. "I could have sworn I came to a complete stop," Michelle said, her hands gripping the wheel at exactly 10 and 2, just as her father, a retired police officer himself, had taught her. David reached over and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just stay calm, honey. Everything will be fine," he said, though something about the officer's deliberate slowness in approaching their car made his stomach tighten. They had been through situations like this before, too many times to count. Officer Thompson took his time walking to the car, his hand resting casually on his holster. The morning sun glinted off his badge as he approached the driver's side window. Michelle had already rolled it down and placed her hands back on the steering wheel, visible and still. "License and registration," Thompson barked, not bothering with the customary greeting. His eyes darted between Michelle and David, lingering a bit too long on David's hands. "Of course, officer," Michelle replied steadily, her voice calm despite the rapid beating of her heart. She reached slowly for her purse, narrating her movements. "I'm going to get my license from my purse now." "Just hurry up," Thompson snapped, his hand tightening on his holster. David watched the interaction through the rearview mirror, his jaw clenched. As a teacher, he had always taught his students about respect, dignity, and the importance of keeping cool under pressure. Now, he was living those lessons in real time. "Officer," David spoke up, his voice steady and clear, "my wife is 7 months pregnant. We're just coming from her ultrasound appointment. Would you like to see Dash?" "Did I ask you to speak?" Thompson cut him off sharply. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The tension in the air was palpable as Michelle handed over her license and registration with trembling hands. Her baby kicked inside her, as if sensing her mother's distress. "Step out of the vehicle," Thompson ordered suddenly, directing his words at Michelle. "Officer, please," David interjected, his teacher's instinct to protect kicking in. "She's pregnant, and it's cold outside. Surely this isn't necessary for a rolling stop." Thompson's face hardened. "I said, step out of the vehicle. Both of you. Now." Michelle exchanged a glance with David, fear mixing with determination in her eyes. They had discussed situations like this, had role-played them even, but the reality was far more frightening than any practice session. As Michelle struggled to maneuver her pregnant body out of the car, Thompson grew impatient. He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her forward. Michelle let out a startled cry of pain. That's when David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of reacting with anger or force, he reached for his phone and began streaming live on social media, his hands steady and visible. "Good morning everyone," he began, his voice clear and professional, the same voice he used to command attention in his classroom. "I'm David Richardson, a high school chemistry teacher, and I'm currently watching an officer physically handle my pregnant wife during a routine traffic stop. We're on the corner of Maple and Oak Streets. I'm starting this stream not to escalate the situation, but to ensure everyone's safety and accountability." Officer Thompson froze, suddenly aware of the numerous eyes now watching him through David's phone. His grip on Michelle's arm loosened. Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor who had been tending to her front garden, had also begun recording the incident. Other neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, their presence both a witness and a protection. "Officer," David continued, his voice remaining remarkably composed, "I understand you're doing your job, but I would appreciate if you could treat my wife with the dignity she deserves. She's carrying our child, and your current actions are causing her distress. How can we work together to resolve this situation peacefully?" The growing crowd murmured in approval at David's measured response. Several more phones were raised, recording the scene from different angles. Thompson's radio crackled with a voice asking for his status. Apparently, someone had called the station. Michelle stood tall despite her fear, one hand protectively cradling her belly. She hadn't said a word since stepping out of the car, but her dignity in the face of intimidation spoke volumes. The morning sun illuminated her face, highlighting the quiet strength in her expression. The situation had shifted dramatically. What began as a routine traffic stop had transformed into a powerful moment of community solidarity. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other now stood shoulder to shoulder, their presence a silent but powerful statement. A police supervisor's car pulled up to the scene, lights flashing. The morning had started with a simple ultrasound appointment, but it was about to become something much bigger, a testament to the power of composure in the face of injustice, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is dignified resistance. As the supervisor stepped out of his car, David continued streaming, his phone steady, his voice clear. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about every similar incident that had gone unrecorded, every moment of injustice that had been swept under the rug. And this time, thanks to David's quick thinking and composed response, the truth would be impossible to ignore. Sergeant Wilson, the supervisor who had just arrived, quickly assessed the scene before him. The growing crowd of neighbors, the multiple recording phones, and most importantly, the sight of a visibly pregnant woman standing uncomfortably by her car while Officer Thompson maintained his aggressive stance, it all painted a clear picture. "What seems to be the situation here, Officer Thompson?" Sergeant Wilson asked, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The live stream on David's phone had already attracted thousands of viewers, with comments and shares multiplying by the second. "Rolling stop violation," Thompson replied stiffly, his hand still hovering near his holster. Subjects were uncooperative. A ripple of disagreement moved through the crowd. Mrs. Chen, still recording from her garden, spoke up with the authority that only decades of life experience could provide. "That's not true. I watched the whole thing. They were nothing but polite." David continued his calm narration to the live stream audience, his teacher's voice steady and clear. "The sergeant has arrived and is now speaking with Officer Thompson. My wife has been standing in the cold for several minutes now. She's 7 months pregnant, and I'm concerned about her well-being." Sergeant Wilson turned to Michelle, noting how she protectively cradled her belly. "Ma'am, are you all right? Would you like to sit down?" Before Michelle could answer, Mrs. Chen hurried forward with a lawn chair from her garden. "Here, dear, please sit. This isn't good for the baby." The simple act of kindness from their neighbor brought tears to Michelle's eyes. As she carefully lowered herself into the chair, she felt a sharp twinge in her abdomen. Her face must have shown her discomfort because David immediately moved toward her, his phone still streaming. "Sir, please stay where you are," Thompson barked, but Sergeant Wilson held up his hand. "Let him check on his wife," the sergeant ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. He had seen enough. "Officer Thompson, a word please." As Thompson stepped aside with his supervisor, David knelt beside Michelle, his free hand finding hers while his other continued holding the phone steady. The live stream comments were flooding in with messages of support, prayers, and shared experiences. "I think we need to get you checked out at the hospital," David whispered to Michelle, noting how she winced again. "The stress isn't good for either of you." Another police car pulled up, followed by an ambulance. Word had spread quickly through the community, and local news vans were beginning to appear at the edges of the growing crowd. What had started as a simple traffic stop was rapidly evolving into something much bigger. A young paramedic approached Michelle, her face kind and professional. "Mrs. Richardson? I'm going to check your vitals, okay? How far along are you?" 7 months, Michelle replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I was just at my doctor's appointment. Everything was perfect." Her hand tightened around the ultrasound pictures still in her purse, those precious images of their daughter now seeming like they were from another lifetime ago, though it had been less than an hour. The news crews were setting up their equipment now, and several reporters were approaching Sergeant Wilson, who had finished his conversation with Officer Thompson. Thompson stood apart from everyone, his face a mask of barely contained anger as he watched his routine traffic stop transform into what would likely become the evening's top story. One of David's students, who lived in the neighborhood, had arrived with his parents. The teenager called out, "Mr. Richardson. We've got your back. Best teacher ever." Several other students who had been watching the live stream began sharing their own stories in the comments about how Mr. Richardson had taught them to handle conflict with dignity and intelligence. The paramedic completed her initial assessment of Michelle. "Your blood pressure is elevated, which is concerning given your condition. I recommend we transport you to the hospital for monitoring." David's live stream had now reached over 50,000 viewers. His calm, professional demeanor throughout the ordeal had struck a chord with people across the country. Comments poured in from teachers, parents, and citizens of all backgrounds, praising his composed handling of the situation. As the paramedics helped Michelle onto a stretcher, David finally turned to address Sergeant Wilson directly, though he kept the phone recording. "Sergeant, I'd like to file a formal complaint about Officer Thompson's conduct. I also want to ensure that my wife receives proper medical care, and that any costs incurred due to this unnecessary escalation are properly addressed." Sergeant Wilson nodded gravely. "I understand, sir. I've already contacted Internal Affairs, and they're on their way. We'll need your statement, but please take care of your wife first. We can handle the paperwork later." The community's response continued to grow. Someone had set up a social media support group, and offers of help were pouring in. Legal professionals were reaching out through the live stream comments, offering their services pro bono. Local civil rights organizations were mobilizing their resources. As Michelle was being loaded into the ambulance, Mrs. Chen approached with a small bag. "I packed some water and snacks for you both. And here's my phone number. Whatever you need, day or night, you call me. We're all family here." David finally ended his live stream with a simple message: "Thank you all for watching and supporting us. This isn't just about my family anymore. It's about every family that has ever faced similar treatment. It's about holding people accountable and standing up for what's right, not through violence or hatred, but through dignity, community, and truth." The story was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted in those tense morning hours. A community had come together, technology had given voice to the voiceless, and one man's composed response to injustice had sparked a conversation that would continue long after the news vans packed up and the crowds dispersed. The emergency room at Atlanta Metropolitan Hospital buzzed with activity as Michelle was wheeled in, David walking steadily beside her stretcher. His phone had stopped streaming, but the impact of his broadcast continued to ripple through social media. Outside the hospital, a small group of supporters had already gathered, holding handmade signs with messages of encouragement. Inside, Dr. Patricia Wong, the attending physician, quickly reviewed Michelle's vitals while listening to David recount the morning's events. Her experienced eyes noted every wince and grimace on Michelle's face, every spike in the fetal heart monitor's steady beeping. "The baby's showing signs of distress," Dr. Wong explained, her voice calm but serious. "We need to monitor both of you closely for the next few hours. The elevated blood pressure concerns me, and the physical stress from this morning's incident isn't helping. Michelle squeezed David's hand, tears finally breaking through her composed facade. I just want our baby to be okay, she whispered. All of this because of a stop sign? Down in the hospital lobby, local news crews had begun setting up for their evening broadcasts. The story had taken on a life of its own. David's live stream had been picked up by national news networks, and clips were already being shared across multiple platforms. His composed handling of the situation was being praised by civil rights leaders and law enforcement reform advocates alike. Back in their neighborhood, Mrs. Chen had transformed her front yard into an impromptu community gathering space. Neighbors brought chairs, refreshments, and shared their own stories of similar encounters. The elderly woman's garden, usually a quiet sanctuary, had become ground zero for a growing movement. I've lived here for 40 years, Mrs. Chen told a local reporter, her garden shears still in hand. I've seen too many good people treated badly. But today, that young man showed us all how to stand up with dignity. And his wife, so brave, thinking of her baby even while being mistreated. This is America too, people coming together, standing up for each other. At the police station, internal affairs investigators were reviewing Officer Thompson's body camera footage alongside David's live stream. Thompson sat in an interview room, his usual confidence replaced by barely contained anger as he watched his actions played back on multiple screens. Officer Thompson, the lead investigator, began, "Your body camera footage shows a clear deviation from department protocol regarding the treatment of pregnant individuals. Can you explain your actions?" Meanwhile, David's high school principal, Dr. Howard, had called an emergency staff meeting. The video of their beloved chemistry teacher handling such a volatile situation with grace had sparked important discussions among students and faculty alike. "This is a teachable moment," Dr. Howard announced to his assembled staff. "Mr. Richardson didn't just teach chemistry today, he taught the entire country a lesson in dignity, composure, and peaceful resistance. We need to be prepared to support our students as they process this event." Back at the hospital, Michelle's parents had arrived, her father's retired police badge still carrying enough weight to get them quickly through the growing crowd outside. Robert Johnson, Michelle's father, stood at his daughter's bedside, his face a mix of pain and pride. "You did everything right, baby girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like I taught you." "And David?" He turned to his son-in-law, extending his hand. "You protected my daughter and granddaughter the right way. With wisdom instead of anger." The fetal monitor continued its steady rhythm as Dr. Wong returned with the latest test results. "Your blood pressure is still higher than I'd like," she explained, "but the baby's heartbeat has stabilized. We're going to keep you overnight for observation." Outside the hospital room, David's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. His students had organized a peaceful sit-in at the school, wearing chemistry-themed t-shirts with slogans like, "Be the solution," and, "Positive reactions create change." Local civil rights attorney Benjamin Clark arrived at the hospital, having offered his services after watching the live stream. In the quiet of Michelle's hospital room, he laid out their options. "What happened this morning was a clear violation of your civil rights," Clark explained, his voice low and serious. "The video evidence is compelling, and Officer Thompson's history of complaints makes this case even stronger. But more importantly, your response to the situation has sparked something bigger. People are watching, learning, and being inspired to speak up." Michelle shifted uncomfortably in her hospital bed, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "I don't want to be the face of a movement," she said softly. "I just want to have my baby safely and live our lives in peace." David sat on the edge of her bed, his teacher's mind already formulating ways to turn this experience into lessons for his students. "Maybe that's exactly why this matters," he replied. "Because we're just regular people who want to live our lives in peace. And that's what everyone deserves." As evening approached, the crowd outside the hospital had grown. Students from David's chemistry classes had organized a candlelight vigil, their electric candles twinkling in the gathering dusk. They sang soft songs of hope and unity, their young voices carrying up to Michelle's hospital window. Inside, as Michelle finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, David stood at the window watching the scene below. His phone showed hundreds of thousands of shares of his video, millions of supportive comments, and countless stories from others who had faced similar situations. The morning's terrifying encounter had transformed into something none of them could have predicted, a catalyst for change, sparked not by violence or hatred, but by dignity, composure, and the power of community. Dawn broke over Atlanta Metropolitan Hospital, casting long shadows through Michelle's room window. She had managed to get some rest, though the fetal monitor's consistent beeping kept her from falling into a deep sleep. David hadn't left her side, dozing occasionally in the uncomfortable hospital chair while keeping one eye on his phone as the story continued to unfold. The morning news shows were all covering the incident. National networks had picked up the story, with headlines reading, "Teacher's peaceful response to police harassment goes viral," and "Pregnant woman's ordeal sparks a national conversation." David's live stream had now reached over 5 million views. At the police station, Chief Robinson sat in his office, reviewing the mounting evidence against Officer Thompson. The Internal Affairs investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar incidents, all previously dismissed or buried under paperwork. But this time was different. This time, there was no hiding from the truth that had been broadcast live to the world. "We've got 7 formal complaints filed in the last year alone," Detective Garcia from Internal Affairs reported, spreading files across the chief's desk. "All involving minority citizens, all involving excessive force, all swept under the rug. Thompson's body camera malfunctioned in 3 of these cases." Chief Robinson rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of years of systemic failures. "And it took a high school chemistry teacher to finally expose it all," he said quietly. "Not with violence, not with accusations, but with dignity and a cell phone." Back at the hospital, Dr. Wong arrived for her morning rounds. The news was cautiously optimistic. "Your blood pressure has stabilized," she told Michelle, reviewing the overnight charts. "The baby's heartbeat is strong and regular. If everything stays stable for the next few hours, we can discuss releasing you this afternoon." Michelle's relief was palpable, but her ordeal had left its mark. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his hand on his holster," she confided to David when the doctor left. "I keep thinking about what could have happened to our baby." David took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her palm. "But it didn't happen. Because we stayed calm, because we knew our rights, because the community stood with us. And now, maybe it won't happen to someone else's baby." Outside the hospital, the story had taken on new dimensions. Local community organizations had set up information booths, offering resources about civil rights, police accountability, and community advocacy. David's students had turned their chemistry-themed protest into an impromptu teach-in, sharing stories and strategies for peaceful resistance. At the high school, Dr. Howard had invited civil rights educators to speak with the students. The school's usual morning announcements were replaced with a thoughtful discussion about civic responsibility and the power of dignified resistance. "Mr. Richardson showed us something important," one student said during the discussion. "In chemistry, he always tells us that the most powerful reactions don't always make the biggest explosions. Sometimes, it's the calm, controlled reactions that change everything." Meanwhile, Officer Thompson's union representative sat across from him in a conference room, reviewing the mounting evidence. "Richard, I'll be straight with you," the rep said, shuffling through papers. "This isn't going away. The video evidence is clear, the public outrage is growing, and your record, well, it speaks for itself." Thompson's face remained stony. "I followed procedure. They were uncooperative." "The video shows otherwise," the rep countered. "And your body camera footage, which mysteriously cuts out right before you grabbed her arm, isn't helping your case. The department is under pressure to take action. Serious action. Back in the hospital room, Attorney Clark returned with updates. The Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department had taken notice of the case. Several other victims of similar incidents had come forward, their stories adding weight to the mounting case against Thompson and the department's handling of previous complaints. "Your story has become a tipping point," Clark explained. "It's not just about one traffic stop anymore. It's about accountability, about changing how these situations are handled. And your approach, calm, dignified, professional, it's changing minds. People who might have dismissed these concerns before are listening now." Mrs. Chen arrived with fresh flowers and home-cooked soup, her gardening clothes replaced with a smart dress. She had become something of a local celebrity, her interviews about community solidarity going viral alongside David's original stream. "The Garden Club is organizing a community safety workshop," she announced proudly. "We're going to teach people about their rights, about supporting each other, about using technology to protect ourselves. And we want you both to speak, when you're ready." As the afternoon approached, Dr. Wong returned with discharge papers. "Remember," she cautioned, "rest is crucial right now. No stress, no excitement. That baby needs calm and peace to keep growing strong." But peace seemed like a distant prospect as David's phone buzzed with news alerts. Officer Thompson had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The police chief had announced a press conference for the following day. Civil rights organizations were calling for a complete overhaul of the department's training and accountability measures. As Michelle changed back into her regular clothes, she paused to look at herself in the hospital room's small mirror. In less than 24 hours, her life had changed dramatically. The ultrasound photos were still in her purse, a reminder of the joyful moment that had preceded their ordeal. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said to David as he gathered their belongings. "All the other mothers out there, all the other babies. How many times has this happened without anyone recording it? How many times has fear won over dignity?" David wrapped his arm around her shoulders, careful of her bruise. "That's why our story matters. Not because we're special, but because we're not. We're just regular people who decided that fear wouldn't win. And look what happened, a whole community stood up with us." As they prepared to leave the hospital, they could hear the crowd outside chanting peaceful messages of support. Their story had become more than just a viral video, it had become a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of dignity over fear, of community over division, of peace over violence. The journey ahead would be challenging. There would be investigations, interviews, possibly court appearances. But as David and Michelle stepped out of the hospital room, they knew they weren't walking this path alone. Behind them stood a community united, before them lay the possibility of real change, and within them grew the strength to face whatever came next with the same dignity that had turned a moment of fear into a movement of hope. The police chief's press conference drew national media attention. The department's headquarters buzzed with activity as reporters set up their equipment, their satellite trucks lining the street. Inside his office, Chief Robinson adjusted his tie one final time, reviewing the carefully prepared statement on his desk. The morning sun streamed through the windows as he stepped up to the podium, cameras flashing. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Yesterday's incident involving Officer Thompson and the Richardson family has brought to light serious issues within our department. After a preliminary investigation, I am announcing several immediate actions." At home, David and Michelle watched the press conference on their living room TV. Mrs. Chen had organized a small group of neighbors to form a protective barrier around their house, keeping eager reporters at bay while allowing the couple some much-needed peace. Effective immediately, Chief Robinson continued, "Officer Thompson has been suspended without pay pending a full investigation. Furthermore, I have ordered a complete review of all complaints filed against our officers in the past 5 years. We are establishing an independent civilian oversight committee to ensure transparency and accountability. Michelle rested her head on David's shoulder, one hand absently rubbing her belly where their daughter kicked steadily. The chief's words brought little comfort against the memory of fear, but they represented a start, a crack in the wall of silence that had protected officers like Thompson for so long. At the high school, David's students gathered in the chemistry lab during lunch break, watching the press conference on their phones. They had transformed the lab into a makeshift command center for their growing advocacy movement, with handmade posters covering the walls and social media updates streaming on the smart board. The actions captured on video yesterday do not reflect the values of our department or our city, Chief Robinson declared. We are implementing immediate changes to our training protocols, particularly regarding the treatment of pregnant women, and establishing new guidelines for traffic stops. In another part of town, Officer Thompson watched the press conference alone in his apartment, his face darkening with each word. His phone had been ringing constantly, journalists seeking comment, fellow officers distancing themselves, his union rep urging him to consider resignation. His 20-year career was crumbling, all because of one traffic stop that someone had decided to film. Back at the Richardson home, Attorney Clark arrived with updates on the civil case. The Justice Department had officially opened an investigation into the department's practices, and several other officers had come forward with information about similar incidents that had been covered up. Your case has created a domino effect, Clark explained, spreading documents across the coffee table. People are speaking up. Officers who've stayed quiet about misconduct are coming forward. The wall of silence is starting to crack. Michelle shifted uncomfortably on the couch, remembering Dr. Wong's instructions about staying calm. I just keep thinking about the other women, she said softly. The ones who weren't being filmed, the ones who didn't have a community to stand up for them. David's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Howard. The school board had approved a new curriculum edition, a unit on civic responsibility and peaceful resistance, inspired by the events of the traffic stop. They wanted David to help develop it, turning his real-world experience into lessons that could inspire the next generation. Outside, the neighborhood had transformed. What began as Mrs. Chen's impromptu gathering in her garden had evolved into an organized community watch program. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now coordinated schedules to ensure vulnerable community members were protected during traffic stops and other police encounters. We're not anti-police, Mrs. Chen explained to a local reporter who had managed to get through the protective circle of neighbors. We're pro-justice. We're pro-community. We're pro-dignity. Look around, people from every background, every age, every walk of life, coming together to say, enough is enough. The afternoon brought more developments. National civil rights organizations had taken notice of David's approach during the traffic stop, inviting him to speak at upcoming conferences about effective peaceful resistance. Educational organizations wanted to develop training materials based on his composed response to aggression. Michelle's father, drawing on his experience as a retired officer, had begun working with police reform advocates to develop new training protocols. It's not enough to just punish bad officers, he explained during a phone interview with a national news network. We need to change the culture that creates them. We need to reward officers who show restraint, who treat every citizen with dignity. As evening approached, David sat grading papers while Michelle rested. His chemistry tests were peppered with notes from students expressing support and gratitude. One student had written in the margin, "You taught us that the most important reactions aren't just about chemicals, they're about choices." The baby kicked particularly hard, and Michelle grabbed David's hand to feel it. She's going to be born into a different world than the one we knew yesterday, Michelle mused. Maybe not a perfect one, but one where people are awake, aware, ready to stand up for what's right. Their moment of peace was interrupted by breaking news alerts on their phones. Officer Thompson had called his own press conference, against the advice of his union and lawyers. The image on the screen showed him standing defiantly at a podium, his police uniform replaced by a civilian suit. "Here we go," David said quietly, turning up the volume. They watched as Thompson began to speak, his words sharp with defensive anger, his demeanor a stark contrast to the dignity and composure that had characterized David's response during the traffic stop. As Thompson's angry denials and accusations filled their living room, Michelle reached for David's hand. "You know what's different now," she said softly. "People can see the truth for themselves. They can compare your response to his. They can decide what kind of community they want to live in." Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Chen's garden, where community members had gathered once again. They shared stories, planned future actions, and discussed ways to maintain momentum once the media spotlight faded. What had started as a frightening encounter had evolved into something powerful, a movement built not on anger or revenge, but on dignity, unity, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. The baby kicked again, as if adding her own voice to the chorus of hope rising from the garden. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for change, new chances to choose dignity over fear. But for now, in the quiet of their living room, David and Michelle held on to each other and the promise of a better world for their daughter. The week following the incident brought unprecedented changes to the quiet Atlanta suburb. Officer Thompson's defiant press conference had backfired spectacularly, with his angry outburst providing a stark contrast to the Richardson family's composed dignity. Social media exploded with side-by-side comparisons of the two responses, turning the story into a powerful lesson about choosing peace over confrontation. At the local community center, David stood before a packed room, conducting a workshop on peaceful resistance. The crowd was diverse, young and old, from all walks of life, united by their desire to learn from his example. He had traded his lab coat for a casual button-down, but his teaching style remained the same, calm, methodical, and engaging. "The key isn't to avoid conflict," he explained, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "It's to transform it." When Officer Thompson reached for his holster, he expected fear to control the situation. "Instead, we chose dignity. We chose to show our humanity, and in doing so, we invited others to show theirs." Michelle sat in the front row, her presence a powerful reminder of what was at stake. Her recovery had been steady, though Dr. Wong still monitored her blood pressure closely. The baby had become something of a symbol, a reminder of the future they were all fighting to create. In another part of town, the police department was undergoing its own transformation. Chief Robinson had brought in civil rights experts and community leaders to redesign their training programs. Michelle's father, drawing on his years of experience, had become a key advisor in the process. "We're not just changing policies," the former officer explained during a training session. "We're changing mindsets. Every traffic stop, every interaction, that's not just a procedure to follow. That's a human moment, a chance to either build trust or break it." The investigation into Officer Thompson's past conduct had opened a floodgate. More citizens came forward with their stories, many accompanied by video evidence that had previously been ignored. The pattern was undeniable, and the consequences were swift. Thompson had resigned rather than face termination, but the investigation continued. At the high school, David's chemistry classroom had become a hub of civic engagement. Students incorporated principles of peaceful resistance into their scientific discussions, drawing parallels between chemical reactions and social change. "Remember what Mr. Richardson always says," one student remarked during a class discussion. "In chemistry, catalysts speed up reactions without being consumed in the process." What happened that morning was a catalyst. It sparked change without destroying the people involved. Mrs. Chen's garden had evolved into a permanent community gathering space. She had installed benches and strung up lights, creating a peaceful venue for neighbors to share stories and strategies. The Garden Club's weekly meetings now included segments on civil rights, community organizing, and the power of unity. "In my country," Mrs. Chen shared one evening, her hands dirty from planting new flowers, "we have a saying, the strongest walls are built one stone at a time. What we're building here, it's not just about one incident. It's about laying the foundation for lasting change." The national media attention had begun to fade, but the impact of the story continued to ripple outward. Police departments across the country were studying David's response as an example of how citizens could de-escalate potentially dangerous situations. Civil rights organizations were incorporating the incident into their training materials. Michelle's regular checkups had become opportunities for connection. In the waiting room, other expectant mothers sought her out, sharing their own stories of encounters with law enforcement. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else, a sense of empowerment, of knowing they weren't alone. "Each kick reminds me of why this matters," Michelle told a group of mothers during one visit. "Our children shouldn't have to inherit our fears. They deserve to grow up in communities where dignity isn't just a word, it's a way of life." David's live stream had inspired a movement of dignity watchers, citizens trained to document police interactions while maintaining calm and professional demeanor. They worked in pairs, one recording while the other narrated events clearly and objectively, just as David had done. The school board had approved funding for a new program combining science education with civic engagement. David's students were leading the way, developing projects that demonstrated the practical applications of peaceful resistance principles. "It's like a chemical buffer solution," one student explained during a presentation. "It maintains stability even when stress is added to the system. That's what Mr. Richardson showed us, how to be the buffer in tense situations." At home, David and Michelle were preparing for their daughter's arrival. The nursery walls were painted with a garden theme, inspired by Mrs. Chen's Sanctuary of Peace. Above the crib hung a framed quote, "Dignity is not negotiable." The baby's kicks had grown stronger, each movement a reminder of the precious life they had protected through their composed response to aggression. Michelle often found herself talking to her unborn daughter about that morning, not as a story of fear, but as a lesson in courage. "Your daddy showed me something that day," she would say, rubbing her belly gently. "He showed me that true strength isn't about who can shout the loudest or show the most force. It's about standing firm in your humanity, even when others try to deny it." The community had changed in subtle but significant ways. Neighbors who had once hurried past each other now stopped to chat. People exchanged phone numbers, ready to serve as witnesses if needed. The police presence in the area had shifted, more foot patrols, more community engagement, less aggressive enforcement. Chief Robinson had made good on his promises. The Civilian Oversight Committee was operational, with Mrs. Chen serving as one of its inaugural members. Body camera footage was now automatically uploaded to secure servers, preventing convenient malfunctions. Training protocols emphasized de-escalation and community trust building. As the sun set on another day of positive change, David sat in his classroom after hours, preparing for the next day's lessons. On his desk sat a thank you card from a student. "You taught us more than chemistry. You taught us how to change the world without losing ourselves in the process." The story of that morning's traffic stop had become more than just a viral video or a news headline. It had become a template for transformation, a reminder that the most powerful changes often start with a simple choice, the choice to respond to fear with dignity, to meet force with composure, to transform conflict into opportunity for growth. 1 month after the incident, the Justice Department announced the completion of its preliminary investigation into the police department's practices. The findings confirmed what the community had long suspected, a pattern of biased enforcement and inadequate oversight that had created an environment where officers like Thompson could operate with impunity. The announcement came on a warm afternoon as David was finishing his chemistry class. His students had developed a remarkable ability to connect scientific principles with real-world change, turning their laboratory into a workshop for social transformation. Just like in a chemical reaction, he explained to his class, change in society requires the right conditions, the right catalysts, and most importantly, the right balance. Too much force destroys the reaction. Too little energy, and nothing changes at all. At home, Michelle had entered her 8th month of pregnancy. The nursery was complete, its walls adorned with messages of hope and strength. Dr. Wong had given them good news. Despite the stress of the incident, both mother and baby were healthy and strong. "Your daughter is resilient," Dr. Wong said during a checkup, smiling as she moved the ultrasound wand across Michelle's belly. "Just like her parents. She's going to come into a world that's a little bit better because of what you both did." The police department had undergone significant changes. Chief Robinson's reforms were showing promising results. New officers were being trained using materials that included David's live stream as an example of how citizens might respond to police encounters, and how officers should handle such situations. "We're not just changing procedures," the chief explained during a community meeting. "We're changing the culture. Every officer needs to understand that authority comes with responsibility, and respect must be earned, not demanded through force." The Community Watch program, born in Mrs. Chen's garden, had spread to neighboring districts. Citizen observers, trained in peaceful documentation techniques, helped ensure accountability during police interactions. Their presence alone often helped de-escalate tense situations. "It's like tending a garden," Mrs. Chen would say during training sessions. "You don't just plant the seeds and walk away. You must nurture, watch, protect. Our community is our garden, and we are all its caretakers." David's approach during the traffic stop had been incorporated into civil rights training programs across the country. Organizations invited him to speak, but he chose to focus on local impact, believing that real change started at home. The high school had become a model for combining academic excellence with civic engagement. Students in David's chemistry class had started a peer mentoring program, teaching younger students about both science and civil rights. "Mr. Richardson taught us that every reaction has a choice," one student explained during a presentation. "We can choose fear, or we can choose dignity. We can choose silence, or we can choose to speak up. The chemistry of change is all about making the right choices." Michelle's father had become an influential voice in police reform discussions. His unique perspective as a retired officer and the father of a victim of police misconduct carried special weight in debates about department policy. "I served for 25 years, he said during a police academy training session. "I know the pressures officers face. But I also know that power without compassion becomes abuse. When that officer grabbed my pregnant daughter, he wasn't protecting or serving, he was bullying. And that's not what the badge stands for." The story had inspired a documentary filmmaker, who approached the Richardsons about sharing their experience. After careful consideration, they agreed, seeing it as another way to spread the message of dignified resistance. "We're not looking to shame anyone," David explained during an interview. "We're looking to show that there's a better way. That when we respond to aggression with dignity, we create space for real change." Officer Thompson had left the state, but his legacy sparked important conversations about accountability in law enforcement. His body camera footage, along with David's live stream, became teaching tools in police academies nationwide. At the community center, Michelle led a support group for others who had experienced similar encounters. The meetings provided a safe space for sharing stories and strategies, turning trauma into empowerment. "Each of us has a choice in these moments," she would tell the group, her hand resting on her growing belly. "We can let fear win, or we can stand in our dignity. And when we choose dignity, we show others that it's possible." The baby's due date was approaching, and the community prepared to celebrate not just a new life, but a symbol of hope. Mrs. Chen organized a garden party baby shower, transforming her sanctuary into a space of joy and anticipation. "This child," she announced, raising a toast with sparkling cider, "will be born into a community that stood up for what's right. She will know that her parents chose dignity over fear, and that choice changed not just their lives, but all of ours. David's students had created a special gift, a book of letters for the baby, sharing what they had learned from her parents' example. The pages were filled with promises to carry forward the lessons of that morning. Dear Baby Richardson, one letter read, "Your daddy taught us about chemical reactions in class, but he taught us about courage in life. Your mommy showed us what strength really looks like. You're going to grow up knowing that one person's dignity can change the world." As evening settled over the community, David and Michelle sat in the nursery, reading the letters together. The baby kicked energetically, as if responding to the words of hope and change. "You know what I realized?" Michelle said softly, taking David's hand. "That morning could have broken us. Instead, it made us stronger. Not just us, but everyone around us. It showed us what we're capable of when we refuse to let fear win." Outside, the lights in Mrs. Chen's garden twinkled like stars, illuminating the gathering space that had become the heart of their transformed community. The flowers she had planted in the days following the incident were now in full bloom, a living testament to the power of nurturing change. 2 months after the traffic stop incident, on a beautiful spring morning, the community gathered once again, this time to welcome its newest member. Little Hope Richardson had arrived during the early hours, her first cries mixing with the dawn chorus of birds in Mrs. Chen's garden. The timing seemed perfect. Just as the flowers were blooming and new life was springing up everywhere, this baby girl entered the world as a living symbol of everything her parents' dignity had helped create. Dr. Wong had overseen the delivery, smiling as she placed the healthy baby girl in Michelle's arms. 7 pounds, 6 ounces of pure hope, she announced to the anxious father. David, who had remained as composed during the delivery as he had during that fateful traffic stop, finally let his tears flow freely as he held his daughter for the first time. The news spread quickly through their tight-knit community. Mrs. Chen was the first visitor, arriving with armfuls of flowers from her garden and happy tears in her eyes. "She is beautiful," the elderly woman whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "A flower blooming from the soil of struggle." At the police department, more changes were taking root. The Civilian Oversight Committee had just published its first quarterly report, showing promising signs of transformation. Complaints against officers had decreased significantly, while community engagement had reached unprecedented levels. Chief Robinson visited the hospital himself, not as a police official but as a member of the community. He brought with him news that would give Hope's birth even more significance. The department had just implemented a new training program, officially named the Richardson Protocol, focusing on dignity-based policing. "Your daughter will grow up in a different kind of community," he told the new parents. "One where law enforcement and citizens work together, where dignity isn't just a word in a manual, but a living practice." In David's classroom, his students had decorated the lab with pictures of chemical reactions that represented transformation and positive change. They had also created a special wall dedicated to Hope's equations, formulas that mixed scientific principles with lessons about social justice and peaceful resistance. Just like in chemistry, one student's poster read, "The most powerful changes often start with a single catalyst." Baby Hope is our reminder that even the smallest addition can transform an entire reaction. The documentary about their story was nearing completion. The filmmaker had captured the community's transformation, from the tense moments of the traffic stop to the joyous arrival of Baby Hope. The final scene would show the community gathering in Mrs. Chen's garden to celebrate new beginnings. Michelle's father, still actively involved in police reform efforts, held his granddaughter with tears in his eyes. "I spent my career wearing a badge," he said softly to the sleeping infant. "But you, little one, you've already done more to change policing than I ever did. Your story is changing how we think about power and dignity." The support group Michelle had started continued to grow, now meeting twice weekly in the community center. New mothers would bring their babies, creating a space where healing and hope intertwined. They shared stories, strategies, and dreams for their children's future. Having hope here makes everything we went through feel different, Michelle told the group during a meeting, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. She reminds us that our struggles aren't just about dealing with what happened to us, they're about creating something better for those who come after us. David had received numerous offers to write books or give national speeches about his approach to peaceful resistance. Instead, he chose to focus on teaching, believing that the most profound changes happen in everyday moments, in classrooms and communities. Every day in class, I see the next generation of changemakers, he explained to a local reporter. They're learning not just about chemical reactions, but about human ones, about how to transform conflict into opportunity, fear into dignity. The Justice Department's final report on the police department became required reading in law enforcement academies nationwide. It detailed not just the problems that had been uncovered, but more importantly, the community-driven solutions that had emerged. Officer Thompson's story became a cautionary tale in police training sessions, but it wasn't told with anger or blame. Instead, it was presented as a turning point, a moment when one community chose to respond to force with dignity, and in doing so, created a model for positive change. Mrs. Chen's garden had become a registered historical site, recognized for its role in fostering community transformation. The benches where neighbors had first gathered to support each other now bore plaques with quotes about dignity and unity. New flowers were planted regularly, each one representing a story of positive change in the community. You see, Mrs. Chen would tell visitors, pointing to the diverse blooms, just like in this garden, our community grows stronger when we tend to each other, when we protect the vulnerable, when we choose to bloom despite the shadows. As hope grew stronger each day, her parents marveled at the world she would inherit. The changes sparked by that morning traffic stop had created ripples that continued to spread. Other communities began adopting similar approaches, creating their own gardens of change, their own protocols for dignity. The high school's graduation ceremony that year was particularly meaningful. David's students had chosen "Dignity Through Action" as their class motto, and each graduate wore a small chemistry-themed pin representing positive transformation. During quiet moments in the nursery, David and Michelle would often share their hopes for their daughter's future. They didn't wish for her to never face challenges, they wished for her to face them with the same dignity that had transformed their community. "You know what's amazing?" David said one evening, watching Hope sleep peacefully in her crib. "That morning, when everything could have gone so wrong, we chose dignity. We didn't know it then, but we weren't just protecting ourselves, we were building a foundation for her future." Michelle smiled, remembering the ultrasound pictures that were still in her purse during the traffic stop. And now she's here, reminding us every day that change is possible. That fear doesn't have to win. That dignity, when we choose it, can transform everything. Outside the window, the lights in Mrs. Chen's garden twinkled in the evening breeze. The flowers that had witnessed their community's transformation continued to bloom, their colors bright against the darkening sky. And in her crib, baby Hope slept peacefully, unaware that her very existence was a testament to the power of choosing dignity over fear, unity over division, and love over hate. The story of that traffic stop would be told many times in the years to come. But it would never be just about one morning, one officer, or one family. It would be about a community that chose to stand together, about people who found strength in unity, and about the profound truth that when we respond to injustice with dignity, we create space for hope to bloom.